It's great to be here, Toni, in conversation with you. I first read this manuscript last year as an entrant into the Flannery O'Connor contest that is hosted by University of Georgia Press. And the minute I started reading, I knew that this book was the one, because when you find it, you find it. And I would love to know a little bit about the genesis of this collection of interlinked stories.
Yeah, I was in graduate school from 2006 to 2008, and the earliest draft of the book was my final manuscript. So, it was called Light Skin Gone to Waste. The stories were almost exclusively Maddie stories, except for one story from Susie. So I didn't yet have any of the father stories or Velma and Gertie. So it started out as a book just about Maddie. So that was the genesis. And I was inspired years before that to do it because I was working on the Ruby Bridges story, and there was an incident on set where a little boy who was playing a character who was with Ruby, they're both 6 years old. It was a 6-year-old actor on set, and he had to say the N-word. He had to say, "My mother told me not to play with you because you're an N-word," but he actually had to say the actual word. And this little boy got on set, and the camera rolled, and he refused to say it. And he said, "I can't say that, that's me." And then they talked him through it, and he finally agreed to do it, and he did it. But as soon as Uzan called cut, he threw himself into Chaz's lap and hugged her, and he was crying, and he said, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it, I didn't mean it." And I was so moved by that, and it reminded me of my childhood friend who called me that word and never did apologize. And I was just so hopeful. This little boy felt enough for Chaz and her feelings to be concerned that it would hurt her. He was only 6, so it was hard for him to discern that these were lines he was given. He just didn't want her to feel bad. And so that was when I started thinking about the first story that I wrote, which was Claiming Tobias.
It's interesting because, of course, the minute you said little boy and N-word, I thought of that story. And it's interesting how you can then build a constellation of stories around a single moment. So how do you go from there to branching out into telling the stories of Philip and Velma and Livia and Maddie?
So I had the Maddie stories, and I was working with an agent who started reading the stories, and it was just those stories. And I finished a draft of what I thought was the book. And she said, "I think you need more points of view." And so I started expanding them. And that's when I thought about the Phil story and the first Phil story when they're moving there. It just sort of made sense to do it chronologically. So I started with Phil, and then I wrote the next story, which was from Livia's point of view, but that got excluded from the book. So there was a whole long process, and the book ended up being 500 pages, and it had Phil and Livia. It had the Megnas had their own story. It had 2 novellas, and then that book went out as a novel, and it didn't sell. And when it didn't sell, and then I saw that you were the judge for the Flannery O'Connor Award, I pulled the book apart and I slapped it back together, prioritizing Maddie. And that's what I sent in. So we lost Livia, we lost an Emily story, we lost the Megna stories, but I still have all those stories. And I would like to do something with them at some other point. So there's a whole another half of a book that exists in that world.
That's interesting, because one of my very first questions when I read this, and even as I was thinking about this afternoon or this evening, was why do you call this a short story collection when really it's a novel?
I always saw it as a short story collection. I was inspired by the collection, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, where Sherman Alexie was looking at his childhood or somebody's childhood on the reservation, and we followed the same characters. And I felt like my book was doing something similar. And so that was how I wanted to build it. But you're not the only one. I mean, the agent thought it was a novel too, but when it went out, the other version of it with all of those points of view, editors didn't like it. They thought it was unwieldy and it was just too much. So I went back to the short story idea, and I'm glad that it feels sort of like a novel, but then a little disappointed that it doesn't feel exactly like a short story collection. So,
of course.
you know.
Well, I mean, it does also feel like a short story collection. I have to say, the stories are incredibly distinct, and especially when the way we fell out of touch, like that's a story where it's connected, certainly, and it's significant, but it's also something that exists on its own. And so the stories all stand alone and work together. And I think it's just an interesting dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think we would love to hear a story if you wouldn't mind reading something for us.
I would love to. I'll read the shortest story. It's the last story in the book. This is Time Travel. 21 years later, I'll run into you outside the PATH station in Hoboken, in front of the wide green awning that leads down to the trains, sounds of rumbling below and the din of chatter swirling. You'll yell my name above the noise, saying it like a question, as if you could actually be unsure that it's me. I'll turn and totter on the top step just in time. Seconds later, and I'd be swept into the stream of bodies flowing to the tracks. It'll be shortly after 5 p.m. on a late September weekday, humid and sunny, with air that smells of commuters caught in unexpected high heat. Perspiration will roll down my back and leak between the butt cheeks you used to make fun of. I'll squint against the sun and stare at you. You'll smile with closed lips and brown eyes that will be gentler than I remember. Several seconds will pass before you'll say, wow, first time I've ever seen you away from home. Where are you living these days? Manhattan, I'll say. Oh, the big city, you'll say, like it's a truly good thing. I'll nod. I won't ask you anything. I'll look at you and wait. Suits of blue, black, gray, and tan will dodge and whoosh past us in both directions, heels clicking on concrete, huffs and impatient scoffs. We'll be in the way. I'll shield my eyes with one hand and be silent for so long, it'll feel impolite. You'll hold a cheap gray suit jacket over one shoulder, your white collared shirt bearing sweat marks under the arms. You'll smell of obsession for men, alluring and more sophisticated than the Old Spice I used to notice at the bus stop during high school when you rarely spoke to me. Your chest will be broad and you'll be slim like me, which will mean something because 21 years earlier, we were chubby 6-year-olds foraging together for ding-dongs and Oreos my mother hid deep in the pantry so we wouldn't overeat. We'd find them and eat them all. And that thrill was a bond we shared. But being connoisseurs of Nabisco cookies and Hostess snack cakes and being buddies from the time we could crawl never made our bond as strong as the one you shared with every kid in the neighborhood but me. Someone will bump into you and you'll fall into me and grab my arm before I lose my balance on the top step. Sorry, you all right? You'll ask. I'll say, fine, thanks, and take my arm back. That day, 21 years after I lost you, I'll be wearing a tomato red kufi atop unapologetically kinky hair, wild kinks I tamed the soul out of when I lived across the street from you, hoping straight hair would make me pretty and more like everyone else. But you called me an ugly, bubble-butted nigger at the bus stop. Elementary school became junior high, which turned into high school, and I barely existed. You had all those years to speak to me. That day I'll wonder, why now? I'll have on black chunky boots and a dress that's lime green like Lifesavers candies. Red, black, and green are Pan-African colors, and I'll wear them because at the time I'll be mad and militant saying fuck you to you and everyone else from home who said my color, my hair, and my big butt made me ugly. That day at the PATH station, it won't matter to me that you were only a boy when you said those things. I won't smile. I won't be warm. I'll forget any mean things I may have said back at the bus stop. I probably said some because I will remember how you winced at the mention of your fat mom, crippled father, and port wine stained birthmarked baby sister. My tongue, sharpened on figurative and literal sticks and stones hurled at me by neighborhood bullies, must have pierced your soft spots sometimes too. Yet you'll look at me that day with a tenderness that insists cruel words never pass between us. Your dark hair will be short, your skin clean shaven, clear, the spots of adolescence healed and faded. Your face will flush and your eyes will brighten the way they used to shine when you were my round-cheeked running buddy. You'll look deep into me with such warmth that against my will, you'll begin to melt the icicles that numbed me inside. My name, when you say it, will sound like songs from playtimes past. In your eyes, I'll catch a glimpse of us singing on swings, flying above the grass where we found four-leaf clovers. You'll invite me into a little chamber of your heart where you saved us. But I won't go. I won't be ready to remember how to get there. There will be no mention of what happened to us or what didn't happen that you'll sing my name again, a young boy's sweetness shining out of your grown man's face, and you'll say, you were my first best friend. I'll know you're telling me you're sorry. You didn't mean to hurt me. You were just a kid. I'll nod politely and shrug off your words of apology. I'll carry my bubble butt and my baggage down the stairs, catch my train, and move on with my life. In another 21 years, I'll be middle-aged and softer inside and out, the rough edges of resentment worn down with experience. I'll remember how you said my name that day and the way you looked at me with affection. I'll transport myself back to the PATH station in front of the stairs, trains rumbling below, bodies whooshing by, and I'll be kinder to you. I will, because by then I'll know that love is the only feeling left once enough time has passed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading that story. It clearly moves you a lot. How do you balance narrative and emotion? And yeah, how do you balance?
I'm not sure that I do balance it. I started off as an actor. I went to the Lee Strasberg Theater Institute as a child. I started at age 14 and I was already studying acting before that at 12. And my writing started with writing things for myself to read. And so everything that I write, I am feeling the emotion. And if there is a balance, it's that I then also went to learn how to write prose. So I did cultivate the ability to write. It's not just raw emotion thrown on the page, but I don't necessarily separate it from how I feel about the narrative that I'm writing. It's all pretty emotional for me, unless the character themselves are dispassionate. So if they're feeling it, I'm feeling it with them. I'm feeling it when I write them.
Yeah, I the same holds true for my writing. I don't like draw a line between the two, like emotion or narrative. I think emotion is infused in a lot of my stories. And I also think about addressing sort of some of the bigger social issues that we contend with. Mm-hmm. But first and foremost, I write to entertain. And I felt that sense of narrative and entertainment in your story. So how do you balance good storytelling while also tackling the issues that matter to you, especially in this collection? I would say, classism and racism and how you survive as a Black person in a predominantly white community.
Yeah, I'm always thinking about what makes it fun to read, and I'm always hearing it in my head. So I have, swatches of dialogue that I remember. I remember the way that my parents said things or phrased things, but they're not as fun as I can make them. So I'm thinking about like, how can I change what they said so it's not a cliche? So I turn it and make it a little bit more interesting. And I also had a lot of training as a screenwriter. And so I am thinking about structure too, and setup and payoff. And so all those things are coming into play. And I don't always do this, but I try to find moments of humor, even in the parts of the stories that are pretty sad. Sometimes it's not possible, but when it is, I try to find the humor in it. And so I want to make it fun for myself to read, because I'm reading them over and over and over as I work. And so if I'm bored by it, I suspect that a reader is going to be bored by it. So I will try to like tweak and cut and move, and like, oh, as much as I love this, it's not really working. So I will be kind of hard on myself to try to keep it fun and entertaining. And I kind of watch the scenes in front of me. So I want to, I do like to see the dynamic of what the characters are doing with each other, how they're playing off of each other. So I'm imagining that almost like it's a film in front of me. And so if that's entertaining, and I try to get that on the page and make that entertaining as well.
You said that you're hard on yourself as a writer. Are you ever satisfied with your work? Do you ever read something you've written and think, yes, this is what I wanted?
Not often, but there are parts of the Susie story that are so fun to read because she's got so much rhythm in her voice. And when I read her, I love reading her voice. And so in that story, I'm not satisfied with the story as a whole, but there's her voice satisfies me. I love her voice. And sometimes I have that experience with Velma, where some of her passages in the Gertie Velma story, I'm satisfied with. I am not ever entirely satisfied. I mean, I could never read through one of my stories and not find something that, oh, I could have lost, that's too much. I could cut that. Even like right before I read, I might, be at a reading and see, oh, I don't need this. Like I could cut. So no, just parts. There are parts that do work.
One of my favorite things about this collection was the characters, who are extremely memorable. And I wanted to follow them from story to story and see, how things turn out for them. And I was particularly interested in Philip Arrington, who's the main character at the start of the collection. Because he's flawed. He is just a flawed man. And I think it takes work to create nuanced characters who are not completely good or evil. So I would love to know how you develop your characters.
Well, these characters, they're sort of a cheat because they existed. So I was fictionalizing characters who already were real to me. So I just, as I said before, like, some of the dialogue that I remembered in the way that my parents spoke, I would tweak their dialogue, but these characters, came to me from my life, as opposed to other things that I've written that were wholly fictional, where I just made them up from scratch. I started with the real person, and then they certainly are a fictionalized version of those characters. How could they not be? Because I'm not looking at them objectively. I'm looking at them from my lens. If my father were to write this collection, Phil would probably turn out much differently. So it's my version of this man at this point. And I wasn't even born in the first story. So that was a lot of imagination and things that my sister told me, things that my mother told me, and then things that I did just make up, like where they lived originally. And my father told me some of the stories about before he moved to the house and what happened. And I, just imagined the space and created it. But those characters, yeah, I can't take credit for all the characters. A lot of them are real.
How do you make decisions about which elements of the real people to include? Because fictionalizing from our actual lives can be incredibly challenging. And sometimes people assume you're writing about them when you're like, you weren't even on my mind, my friend. So how do you do that? And what boundaries do you have for yourself and for the people in your life?
That's a broader question. So I was definitely keeping in mind what I wanted to say. So I did want to tell the story about this place and how Phil and Velma saw it, what they dealt with, and what I dealt with. So Phil and Velma had a different experience. But I wasn't always privy to it, but I did know that they could curate their friendships among the professionals in town where I didn't have that option. So I went to public school with everybody, mostly working class kids, a lot of the children of firemen and cops. So I was sort of trying to get at the working class world that I was thrown into, and sort of being like a fish out of water there, not just by being Black, but by the fact that my family traveled. My father was highly educated. I did things, I went into the city and went to shows and did things that were different from a lot of the kids that I was growing up with. So I think I've lost my way with this question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But in terms of what I would fictionalize, I was steering the collection, molding it sort of to say what I was trying to say. So I was definitely picking and choosing the things that would come through to tell the story that I wanted to tell in terms of the dynamics of race and class. So, cherry picking, like I chose this, I left that out, things like that. And yeah, I think that's it.
Lost my train of thought.
I'm sorry. So did
No, it's all good. I was really intrigued by Velma as well. In fact, I think at first Philip was my favorite character, and then it was Velma.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept wanting to learn more and more of her story. And so
I saw that in the notes.
Yes.
I
was like, give me more Velma. Give me more Velma.
There is another story that exists that's similar to the Gertie Velma story. There's a Livia Velma story where more of her backstory comes out, her background, and I want to explore that. So if I do go back to those other stories and try to figure out another version, I would like to explore that more deeply. I have written about that. So that reminds me of another part of your question, the boundaries. So it was very difficult to write about my mother's backstory because she did not want people to know. But most of my mother's friends are deceased now. My father is deceased. My sister was mostly removed from the story, but my mother did not want anybody to know what her real background was. And that's part of Velma's problem, is that she's inauthentic. She's putting on sort of this facade of who she is, and Maddie has no access to that. And so they can't connect on a really deep emotional level. There's a barrier because the honesty just isn't there. And I did write about it. The very first thing I ever wrote was a story about what happened to my mother, but I changed it to make it contemporary. And my mother was okay with that, but the rest of the family wasn't. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I hope that she's a little bit more relaxed about it now, because I don't feel like it's anything to be ashamed of, but she was ashamed of being adopted. She was ashamed of having been in foster care. She didn't even call it that. She called them babysitters. So it, that was hard. And if she was more forthcoming about it, I think I might have focused a whole story on it, but I just kind of slipped it in there where I could.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What does your creative process look like from having an idea to putting it on paper?
A mess is what it looks like, scribbles on yellow legal pads and questions, thoughts. Then I might start writing, I might start with a scene or an image and sort of flesh out. And then after I figured out sort of what I'm going to say, then I might start beating out a structure and then filling that in a little bit. But I have to say it's different for different things. Like sometimes I don't do any outlining and I just start. And then sometimes I'm like, okay, I want this to have a 3-act structure, and I create the structure. But I think every story and every novel sort of has its own way that it's going to come into being. And it's not pretty, isn't it? It doesn't look good like as it's happening. It kind of looks like a big mess thrown onto the page.
What were some of your influences that shaped who you are as a writer? Because you have a very distinct voice, but I'm always curious as to, how we become the writers we are.
So as I said, I started out as an actor. So I was influenced, I think, by playwrights. And particularly, like, if you look at the Gertie Velma story, is very theatrical. It is a play. It's like, it's like monologues back and forth. There were a few plays that I saw that were like that. I did a play that took place in South Africa, and that was the approach. It was very direct address to the audience. That play was called Born in the RSA, and I've forgotten who the author was. I think it was co-written by a collective, but that was an influence. There was another play called Incident at San Bajo that was also very much direct address. And then I also read a lot of Tennessee Williams. And then when I was a little older in the 80s, I started reading the August Wilson plays. And so I really liked the voices that had a lot of fun and rhythm to them, and that had a style to the way that people talked. They each character sort of had their own kind of rhythm to them, and that was something that stuck with me. And then just acting myself and writing stuff for myself to act in. I think that was where my style came, but it was certainly influenced by the playwrights that I was reading and going to see.
Are there similarities between acting and writing for you?
For me, there are, but that was actually not always the greatest thing, because I think I assumed that because I could write a monologue, I could write a book, which is not true. So I tried to write a novel just with the skills that I had as an actor, as a screenwriter, and I wasn't very good at it at all. So I did go to graduate school and get an MFA in creative writing, because I didn't understand prose. I did start from a place of just, this is the character and this is what they say. And there's so much more to it than that. So some stories I do that, but I can't do that in every story, or maybe I could, but I didn't want to. I actually wanted to learn, how to write prose. But my prose does sort of have that tendency in it. I notice, like, I've just written a whole another book, and it's in third person, it's prose, but when we're in different POVs of the characters, the prose sounds like the character. It doesn't sound like an objective third person narrator. Every character's narration sounds like them. So that is something that I don't know why I can't stop doing that, but that's just something I naturally do.
Yes, I have those kinds of things too, where I think I can't. This is who I am as a writer, and it is what it is. Hopefully, it will work for a few people. We have some great questions from the audience, and so I want to ask a few of them so that we don't leave anything out. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Gregory asks, how has writing these stories impacted your relationship to the idea of the last line, love is the only feeling left once enough time has passed? How, if at all, has it been a healing process?
It was healing until 2016. And then I found out that all of the people that were racist that I went to school with were still the same. I saw them on Facebook, and all of that stuff came back. And so it shifted my feeling. I want to feel that love. I honestly do, but I'm not going to feel love for you if you're still calling me the N-word, and if you're still, anti-Semitic, and if you're still bullying people who aren't like you. So I wish I could say that I have kept, I've held on to that, but I'm human, and there's things that I I do feel love for that character, for that person that the character was based on, because we had a shared childhood and that was real. But if that person were to then, spew QAnon theories and craziness that was upsetting to me, I would be upset. So I think it just shifts. It just shifts with how the world shifts and how things change.
Yeah, that makes sense. Laura asks, what do you see as the traps for writers who are writing autobiographical fiction, and how do you recommend avoiding them?
Well, I think one of the traps can be just not protecting a person's privacy. And so I did try to do that. Also, some of what I was writing about is like 50 years in the past. And so if I wrote a detail that somebody recognizes, nobody's going to know it's them unless they volunteer that information, because it was 50 some years ago. But I was very careful with certain elements of like my sister's story and making her different. Didn't, just nothing is really the same as what it actually was. And so I do think you have to be careful, especially if you're writing about people who are still around and, we're still close to that year. These stories take place, well in the past. And I think, I don't always write autobiographical stuff. This is just very specific. I don't recommend that that's all we write about is ourselves. I mean, I like creating characters from scratch and fiction, but this just happened to be something I wanted to write. So I would say don't do it if you don't want to do it, if you're worried about it.
Yes, I would agree. Another question is, why is Velma cold and distant to her daughter? What prevents her from being nurturing? Is she, I think, and you've sort of addressed this, is she afraid that it will make her soft?
Well, Velma is a narcissist, and there's a specific set of things that narcissistic mothers tend to do. One is the silent treatment. Sometimes they can be physically abusive. There's a litany of things, and I've studied this, and I can check off all the things. My mother's got all of those things, and that is why. And I think that she really resented her situation. I think she expected to have a different marriage than she ended up having. She expected to always be all about her, and when things weren't always all about her, she was resentful and sad and angry, and Maddie's there. Maddie's the only one there. Velma's a little bit of a bully, and Maddie's bullyable. And so she bears the brunt of Velma's anger. But oddly, Velma does have compassion for Gertie. So she doesn't have empathy for Maddie, but she extends that nurturing kind of motherly part of herself. She does extend that to Gertie. And sadly, I think that sometimes people who have suffered childhood trauma unconsciously treat their children in a similar way that they were treated, and sort of mirror the experience in some ways. And I've seen that happen in different people's lives who have had difficult parents. If you go back and see like what was their childhood like, similar.
Mm-hmm. This is a good question. If you were made to choose a love, would it be acting or writing?
Writing.
That was easy.
Because I can act in my writing. I don't pursue acting anymore, except for in my own stuff. I'm not out there doing auditions. I did for years, but I don't do it. I chose writing, and writing encompasses a lot of things. And I get to do my audiobooks, so I get to act when I read my books.
Which is exciting. Did you do the audiobook for this?
I did. We just finished last week, and I pushed to do it too. Nobody wanted, and it wasn't like they were like, oh yeah, we want to do an audiobook and we want you to do it. No, I like harassed them.
Good. Well, sometimes you have to do that, especially, with smaller presses who don't necessarily always do audiobooks.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to push the issue and just make clear, I actually can do this really well and you won't regret it.
I did. I won the Miller Audio Prize, and I made sure that they knew that. So I was like, see, I can actually do this.
Absolutely. Sakina wants to know, what were you hoping to achieve in this collection in terms of breaking the myth that the Black experience is a monolith? Did you make certain narrative choices to dispel that myth?
Yes. I never saw my family in contemporary fiction. I just, like, we didn't exist, which makes sense because who moves to a community that they actually, where they could afford something better? Who does that? But my parents did that. They lived a little beneath their means until they bought a more expensive house. But I had never seen the dynamic of an upper middle class family around mostly working class white people. And it wasn't that everybody was working class, but a lot of the town was working class, and there weren't as many professionals. There was a Jewish liberal community, but I did make that decision, and I definitely wanted the story with Velma and her white maid because I had never seen that, and I saw The Help, and I was just so upset by that film. I didn't read the book, but I was like, my mother had a white housekeeper. I'm going to write about that. I was like, it was very important to me to show that, yes, there are different types of families. There are different types of Black experiences. We don't all live in the ghetto, nor are we all in the Black elite. There are multiple experiences of being Black. So absolutely, I did. That was a conscious choice.
Wendy asks, do you think that a complete healing would change your voice as a writer?
At this point, no, because I am almost 60 years old. So I am who I am. I'm probably not going to change.
Wait, I'm sorry. You said you're almost how much?
I'm 59. I'll be 60 soon. So I'm not likely to change. I don't like, and I can't say that I haven't had a complete healing. Like, yes, things still hurt me, but I don't walk around. When I read that story, I can connect with that pain, but I'm not walking around with that pain. I'm not dragging it with me. This is who I am. Like, I had a difficult time. I had some good times, and it's all incorporated, and I'm not really mad at anyone anymore. I can be triggered by stuff, but it's not impeding my life. So I can't say that I haven't healed.
I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on the fact that you're 59. I mean, when they say like Black don't crack at all, like not even a little bit.
Not even light-skinned Black.
I mean, not even. I'm blowing my mind.
That's another book. I also write anti-aging books.
You should. I mean,
I did.
Are you drinking a lot of water? Is it yoga?
It's so much that I did write a book.
Really?
I did. It's called Vibrating Youth. Because people used to ask me, and I was like, well, you have to do this, that, blah, 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 blah. There's like a billion things. So I was like, I can't tell you all in one sitting. So I wrote a book.
Amazing.
So it's in the book.
You know, someone has a question about asking if you can talk about the title. And I would love for you to expand on the title, because I think it's a title, if you know, you know. It's not a title that everyone is going to understand the significance of, which is okay. Not everything is for everybody. Right. But I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the title, Light Skin Gone to Waste.
So in the book, it is said specifically to Maddie, when Maddie, who is light skinned and has good hair, cuts all her hair off, and then her hair is just short and kinky. And her aunt says that she's just the tip of the tar brush, which means you're very light skinned, but now your light skin's gone to waste. So that's one interpretation of it. You can also use it to just insult a person of color who doesn't use their light skin privilege. That's another way, or just squanders their light skin privilege. You can use it that way. I was thinking of it as an overarching theme of this family. Like, Phil thought that he was going to have this experience in the white world. But when I look at it, did it make you happy? Like, it seemed to me that it ruined, that this experience sort of ruined the family, where he felt like he had to leave the Black community to be in this white world, and nobody's happy in this family. It's a misery. The marriage falls apart. Maddie's not happy. And then there's also specific instances where I sort of looked at it as thematic. So for Phil, he was the lighter of two brothers. His brother was brown skinned, but his mother, directed all her love towards the browner son. So the light skin didn't work for him. It wasn't useful. So I was kind of looking at it in multiple different ways, and felt like it applied to the book as a whole.
Tiffany asks, did you find it harder to navigate the acting world or the literary world as a Black woman?
Both. They're both. I haven't found either of them to be particularly easy. Like for me, because I started writing because I would show up to auditions and people would be like, what are you? Like, I didn't look Black enough, but I didn't look white. I didn't speak Spanish. So that's why I started writing. I wrote a play for myself to act in, about a biracial girl. I'm not biracial, technically, maybe so, but I have two Black identifying parents. But I wrote that part and said, you can't tell me I'm not right to play this, because I can play this. But I have found both of them pretty hard. Maybe writing is a little bit easier. I've been at it much, much longer. I never had a lot of success as an actress. I had some success as a screenwriter, and I did write a lot of projects about race. So I guess that was easier, but it wasn't that easy. It wasn't that easy.
What is the question about this particular collection you've not yet been asked, but that you want to answer?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think I have an answer for that. A question that I want to be asked. I'm sorry, I'm sort of drawing a blank about that.
That's okay. That's okay. Whenever people ask me that, I'm like, I don't have that. I just don't. In general, I will say that in general, people ask really good questions. And so I also don't know what I want to be asked until I am or am not asked. And so it's not something that I dwell too much on.
Mm-hmm. I'll think about it. Maybe there is one, but I can't think of it in 5 seconds. So
yeah, for sure. The pressure. Do you want to write again for film and television?
Not really. Like, I would love for my work to be bought for film and television. I'd love to make some money again, but I don't want to hear. Like, I don't want to be in the room where there's like sexism and racism and you have to like bite your tongue and all that stuff. It would have to be like a really wonderful situation where I felt respected and valued. And as I said, I am a woman of a certain age. I'm too old to be taking flack and crap from people. I took a lot of shit from people when I worked in the movie business, and I can't hold my tongue at this point. So I'd get fired. If I were in somebody's room, I know I'd get fired. So probably not.
Yeah, writers' rooms are special. They are special. A question I like to ask every creative person I speak to as our conversation comes to a close is, what do you like most about your writing and how you do it?
I guess I've already talked about this, but I like when I get to read characters who are really fun to read. So I love reading my stories aloud when there's a rhythm to them, and there isn't a rhythm to all of them. So I don't read all of them aloud, but when I'm reading the stories that have a flow and a rhythm, I just am filled with joy. It is the thing that I love most. I had so much fun reading the audiobook. I just loved it. I feel like that's I didn't realize this, but I feel like that's why I write. Like I write to read. Like that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm writing to share it, and so I'm always hearing it. I'm a very auditory person in general. I like listening. I learn by listening. So I think that's what I love best. Like when I can get that character to just hum on the page and sound fun, and play with the reading of it, and just enjoy it. That is the greatest pleasure that I have with my work, is reading it.
Are there any challenges to reading your work and making your own audiobooks?
No, I love it. The only challenge is persuading people that I can do it. So I did my first 2 books, I did those on audiobook because I hired myself and I paid for it myself and I did it. But this one, I was asked, like, why do you want to read the audiobook? And I was like, because I can. Got me to a little bit of a tiff because I felt like they didn't want me to do it. But that's the biggest challenge, is just persuading people that I'm the right person to do it, because I'm not known as an actress. So of course nobody wants to like invest money in something that they don't know for sure is going to work out. But you could listen to my first 2 books and tell, and if you think those work, then hire me for the next one. Mm-hmm.
And like my last question, and it's just because I think we're all a little nosy. What are you reading right now?
What am I? Right now, I'm in the middle of If I Survive You.
Oh, good book. I read that 2 weeks ago.
So yeah, that's what I'm in the middle of.
Excellent.
Oh, and I'm also reading I'm Glad My Mother Died by Jeanette Purdy.
I'm teaching a class on cultural criticism this semester, and my students had to do a book review, and one of my students reviewed that book, and the review was such that now I'm going to read it.
That book is so good. I've already read it once, and I'm reading it again because it was so. Now there's a narcissistic mother for you.
Yeah, tell me about it. Based on the excerpts I've read, it's just wow.
Oh, it's so good, and she reads the audiobook too. So I'm reading and listening.
Excellent. Well, Toni Ann, thank you so much for joining me in conversation, especially with 92nd Street Y, which is one of my favorite literary venues in the country. And I loved this book very much. Obviously, I chose it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm so excited it's out in the world.
Thank you so much for doing this and for having me and for choosing the book. I am very grateful. Thank you.
Oh, of course.